going. I thought there was going to be more bodies in the house, but like I said, so is life. It is being recorded, so we'll definitely share it with the rest of the Maya community, as well as Milwaukee. So I'll email folks that. So thank you for coming out tonight. I, of course, have lots of slides to show. I'm a very visual person, so bear with me. But I just wanted to give some shout outs before we get going with introducing panelists to this community here at Maya. Because there's people who are just working their butts off and students who are joining them in that endeavor. So I really wanted to thank all of the student docents who have been trained and in dialogue with Debra and everybody from the Portrait Society, Gallery, and really being able to bring different people in and really show them a fantastic behind the scenes kind of view of the exhibition downstairs, Art Against the Odds. So, of course, I'm going to mention that throughout the night. It's going to come up a lot. But if you guys haven't been able to yet, please go downstairs and check it out. It's a really amazing show. I also want to give a shout out to Morgan and Lexi, who were the jurors for the current exhibition that is going on right here. It's called Black Art and Design, and it's a jury student exhibition. So not only is there FYE students, sophomores and juniors, but also seniors. So I want to give out a shout out to them as well for having their work up in this space. It's perfect. And, a couple examples. Okay, so I have to play favorites here. Madison King, I'm on her thesis panel. So one side is called Pushing Daisies. The other one is Pleasure. I think Pleasure too. So a lot of varied work right there behind you. And also, the Equity and Inclusion Center, which is relatively new on our campus, has this beautiful series that's going on called Black Creatives. So if you guys want to take a peek, it's right in the different panels right by the elevator here on the first floor. And this was an idea that was thought up by students, and it was right before the pandemic struck. So planning and research continued to go on, and then finally it's being realized. So those cards are available, first come, first served, if anybody's interested going to the Equity and Inclusion Center. And I definitely didn't want to start tonight out without saying many thanks to Ricky and I can't talk. And Richard, because without them, we really wouldn't have this document, this plan, here at Maya. And basically, it's impossible to track them down and talk to them during the day because they're always working and they're always with students. So thank you guys so much. And within that plan, I want to give props to our students. That we have that beautiful pink little arrow there, and it's pointing to the word agitation. And for years here at Maya, it's been really, really difficult to be a person of color and be a student at Maya. I started teaching here in 2006. By 2007 or 8, I was doing a fine arts senior seminar, so that means I was in contact with all of the fine arts seniors in the building. And there were 2 students of color in both of my sections. So you can imagine just being, you can't imagine, but if you could, being them in this space. So things have changed a lot. The demographics of Maya are changing a lot. But I would say Maya is still playing catch up because we're part of Milwaukee, which is the most segregated, one of the most segregated cities in America, and we're part of America. And, we have a very complicated history. And I think finally Maya is really getting on board with that. So thank you for all the work that you are doing for our community. A little bit about the class that I'm teaching and this website, Narrative Privilege, the Interview Project. This is the third time that I've been teaching, that I've taught this class rather. The first was in 2015, the second in 2019, and then this spring semester. So these are some images on the website from the first panel that took place. So basically the idea here was to make resource and collect stories of people. And basically the students who take the class, so lots of you guys, are going to be then moving on and interviewing your own interviewees of choice. So these are just some that I would like to highlight. There are recorded audio by the students, and then there's also a photographic portrait component. So the site exists, and I want to spend a lot more time updating the site and making sure that it is working well in concert with my current students. And this interview is actually by Phoenix Brown, which is kind of funny. She is a alumni. She was in the first class that I taught. And she actually, instead of choosing one person, which I thought was really interesting, she went around the dorms and talked to as many people as she could. And she asked them about cultural appropriation. Specifically, smiling, what's good? And if you know what that means, you know what that means. If you know, you can Google it. But about cultural appropriation. So really, really student-driven. This is a shout-out to somebody who's not here tonight. An Uber driver, Alex, who drove me here for her winter break. I came in bouncing off the walls to meet a student who's finishing up an incomplete, and I was so excited about this conversation. I don't know how we started, but we just started talking about education system in the country and the disparities. So I actually interviewed him. I'm going to use that as a resource to help my students edit their interviews. Now I'd like to introduce our panelists here. We're going to go more into detail about what they do professionally and personally. But this is Kristin right over here. Beautiful blonde hair. And you are the founder and the clinical director of CLARA, Healing Institute. And I met you because you formed Punk Rock Therapy, this Facebook group that has been a huge support. Of course, I had to ask, was I punk rock enough to join? But
then that means you are.
It's a great place to, great community to be part of. So thank you very much for coming. And I'll have this, all this information available if anybody wants me to forward the documents. So we'll get a little bit more into your work personally in just one moment. I would now like to introduce Debra Brehmer. Right here. A lot of you know Debra. And very specifically because of the exhibition that is downstairs. She is the owner and director of the Portrait Society Gallery of Contemporary Art, which is just down the way here from Maya in the 3rd Ward, and has been writing as an art critic, art historian for a very long time. And decided to stay in Milwaukee, which I find interesting. So thank you very much for coming. I know there's a lot going on right now, but I needed you in the mix.
Thank you.
I would like to introduce then Takahiro Suzuki at the end here. And he is a disciplinary artist, lots of film and video. And he is the co-founder of a cinema, which puts on regional but also international shows of video and film work. And also you work here at Maya and of course taught numerous classes as well, but you're taking care of the photography and the digital media. So thank you very much for joining us. And John Tyson, right here. You said you didn't like your mug on him, but here we go.
Oops.
I was in conversation with Debra, and I had this huge long list, a wish list of folks I wanted to be involved in this. And I'm so glad that you recommended and that you had time, John, to join us. So this is an image of you in front of, I guess we're just calling it the targets, which is downstairs. And we'll go more into his art in a little bit. All right. So real quickly, I'll try to be brief, but just kind of give you a sense of what we've been talking about during class here. And we started with the scary words, critical race theory, by Kimberly Crenshaw. That whole idea about, that's kind of creeping into our public education system, about what should or shouldn't be read, right? Based on the fact that those books may be telling life stories of people who don't, quote unquote, look like the people in that specific school district, right? And of course that couldn't be further from the truth, but this is what's being told. So we started talking about this on the first day of class because Crenshaw, of course, coined the term intersectional feminism and intersectionality, and it's just so important in our discussion of privilege and discrimination, and everything we were talking about in class. The whole idea that one thing is not happening, many things are happening at once. Somebody might be from a very well-endowed family and grown up with money, but that person may end up, joining the disability community, for example, and then their life takes a turn, right? Or specifically with what Crenshaw was talking about, she felt that Black women were not represented in part of the conversation in feminism. So you'll hear a lot of people say now, if it's not intersectional, it's not true feminism. I don't know how I got far back there. And then I did also just bring up, it's very much like I'm kind of a media junkie, so I share everything that I find with my students, and likewise they share things that they find with me. Just that whole idea about, trigger warnings and what should or should not be included in our history classes, and how an adjunct faculty member lost her job because of it. So one thing we did, this is actually my list that I drafted in 2015. One thing we did early on in class then is everybody wrote down their societal privileges and discriminations. I was clear, before we would actually discuss these, that people didn't have to share anything they didn't want to share as the class was discussing. But I always felt like, and I say this, I don't expect you guys to put yourself out there, and I don't. So I started by sharing my list with class. As things kind of evolved, these huge long lists became old bullet points. And these are kind of some things that we're finding on the website now. Also, in conjunction with that, we discussed Peggy McIntosh's 1998 article, in which she actually really did an itemized list, which really inspired me to have students and myself to do this. And it was a long list. I think there was like 50-some bullet points on it. And some of them seem really mundane, right? The ability to buy a Band-Aid that matches my skin. But I think for herself, writing all of this down and itemizing this really, I think, changed things for her. And she's definitely been kind of an inspiration for the class in that way. Likewise, there's much writing since then, and a lot of people calling for this whole idea, because her article was unpacking the white narrative, white privilege knapsack. So this person is kind of reacting to that. And I think it was interesting. I couldn't even find this article again. So everything on the internet always shifts and disappears. So we have to keep up on that. But I did have a hard copy, so I put some things up here. So the whole thing about this individual, he was saying, you know, I don't like this concept. I don't like these lists that it kind of simplifies things and brings it all down to just demographics or itemized characteristics. And that life is much more complicated now. And I think, you know, as we discussed in class, it very much is. But I do think that, again, collecting data and looking at it does something a little bit different than just telling a story. So it's nice to have both, I think. So this is our whiteboard, our dry erase board. And everybody in the class can attest to the fact that I can't spell. And so constantly I was like getting help spelling words. And I think I do have some kind of diagnosed speech impediment. Like I can read, I know what things mean, but sometimes I can't get the words out or write them. So we started off and it was a very, very nice, neat little list. But then things got a little wacky and crazy. And things were connecting to other things. Even though I personally had gone through this process twice before, I started the class out as a Takahiro because I really wanted to see what students now are bringing to the table. And looking at this versus past boards, this is so much more energetic. And there's so many more terms on here than in the past, which I find very interesting. For example, I remember the first time I did this, the whole discussion of like cisgender, the binary was not discussed, was not brought up, and now we are talking about that. So through this, we're kind of at the point in the class where we're kind of going through this, and I want the class to work together to kind of clarify the main terminologies that will then be updated or fixed on the website, because I want it to be a living site. So that's just an example of that, how things would change. So thinking about words, I think the whole thing about privilege, and I've said this to several people tonight before the event, the whole idea of privilege being something that you had no control over. You just kind of zoomed out of your mother's body, whether she stayed around or didn't, that's a whole nother thing, right? But you zoomed out and you were what you were, right? There's certain things that you were just born into. And so maybe you were born into a very well-off family, right? On the flip side, and I'm not sure if I should even say the flip side, but I keep saying it. On the flip side, discrimination is kind of very similar. If you are born to homeless parents, you are in fact homeless, and you did not do anything, right? So it's not about being lazy or not working hard enough. These things happen, right? So that's that. Really quickly, some other things that we listened to while we were working on our first studio project. So Nicole, of course, is the woman who brought us the 1619 project, of course, who have gotten lots of pushback and death threats just for conducting the work. Very crucial. The same day we listened to in our interview by this gentleman, Bernard Woods. So, Inheritance, an autobiography of whiteness. And it was really interesting because I feel like we don't see this much. The book is on my kitchen table. I'm going to devour it very soon. Haven't done so yet. But the interview interested me and I wanted to share it. He knew things about his past, but he didn't know the details. And so he decided to really find out those details. And he feels like this book is a little bit different than other things that have come before it because he's really good at not letting himself off the hook. I think a lot of times we define something and then we say, oh, we dealt with that, right? And he's very much actively engaged in dealing with whiteness and what that means. And there's fictionalities, there's realness, but very, very interesting interview. And of course, Angela Davis. We couldn't go too far without the discussion of privileges that come up in our society and discriminations without thinking of her. Specifically, this text, Are Prisons Obsolete? So this was written in 2003. What was interesting is a lot of our students were really surprised that we still have, I can't get the word out, execution, something punishment.
Death penalty.
Death penalty, thank you. That the U.S. is still engaged in this. They were really, really surprised. And I think it makes sense because America is so good at not talking about things, right? So this was kind of eye-opening, of course, directly related to the exhibition downstairs. So I'm really glad that we were able to do that. And not only does she talk about, reforms that possibly could take place, but whether they should be abolished in general. And then, of course, different things about gender structures and things that are going on in prisons as well. All right, I'm almost done yammering, I swear. This is some student work. We're kind of right in the middle of doing some critiques. And the piece on the left was created by an individual who's discussing Indian boarding schools and that idea of one's culture being stripped away from them. It's all color pencil. It's quite beautiful. The wall is quite disgusting. That's our critique wall. So. Right next to it is a piece, and this individual is kind of talking about their privilege, which I thought was interesting, because oftentimes it's so much easier to tell your story about what is really, really, what boot is on your neck, But this individual is talking about just, consumerism and that need, desire to buy things, sometimes to make us feel better, but that whole idea of, there's people who don't have adequate clothes for certain climates, and here we are. This is a really bad screenshot of several different parts of an animation that another student has made. But I just thought it really fit in well with the subject matter. So this is about an individual basically being seen as an alien in society by others and increasingly being viewed as a threat. So there's different, there was one more image where there was like a day cityscape or something like that. So again, I'm kind of messing up the narrative here. But just to give you some idea of things that we saw. But it ends with the bars. And then also just two more pieces very quickly. One is based on different political cartoons and going through, it seems like we were talking about during critique, it seems like there's really general ideas here, but as we talked about this, we found out that every figure is very close to somebody in this student's life. And the whole idea of being expected to continue on the namesake and not really wanting that junk. The image on the right is about colorism, specifically in Latin America. So the student actually made an informational site that you can actually go to get some information. But these were just some paint chips with ridiculous at times names. Okay. Now, questions for the panelists. So I'm going to drink a lot of water, and then we're going to go alphabetically because life is chaos. I like order. I love grids. So we are going to start off with Kristin, because your last name dictates it. So what I'm going to do, I either received images from the panelists and or had permission to capture them from online. So that's what I'm sharing. So for you, I am starting with your lists. I'm not going to read these all. I don't expect you to read these all to everybody, but you were gracious enough to share them, specifically with my students who did take time to read them. And I think that's the mystery noise of the building. What is it? Maybe the foundry. Things are being made. So what I was thinking of, each panelist has a list that I will project for a little bit, but then there's also images from the work. So I thought that I'd let it be pretty organic. I can kind of go through the images, and if you want to say something about them, or I can just go through them all, and then you can tell me the toggle back to various ones.
Sure, that's fine.
Okay. But I'd be interested, and my students were as well, different, kind of the whole idea of making this list, how that kind of affected. Did you want to say anything about that?
Oh, sure.
Initially?
Yeah, sure. So I just sort of, when you asked me to make the list, and I just quickly, I remember when you asked about participating in this, you sent a few other examples of folks from the past and what their different lists look like. And I looked at them very quickly, and then I decided that I wanted this to be a relatively organic process where I just kind of sat down with like a sketchbook and whatever came to mind. And then after a while, I actually honestly had a really hard time coming up with the societal discriminations a little bit more. I mean, I am a person that does, especially on the exterior, embodies a lot of, unearned societal privileges that I was born with, being able-bodied and white. But I actually asked my mother-in-law happened to be staying with us, and my husband, and so I asked them to help me out with this list a little bit, and then by kind of getting that outside perspective on like their perception and how those blind spots in my own perception. I'm trying to think if there's like other something in particular that stands out as something that maybe my husband offered or somebody else offered. I'm trying to think, but either way, it was interesting because I mean, these things are all very much a part of who I am. A lot of them aren't, other than like sort of the health and like, I guess like gender identity and ADHD, that's not going anywhere. But a lot of these aren't necessarily things that are actively happening in my life anymore. They're things that were a part of my childhood, essentially. So that was just like an interesting thing to notice. And then I guess another just little interesting moment, so as it describes up there, I'm a mental health therapist, so I work with folks all the time. I'm doing psychotherapy and counseling, and until recently, recent years I should say, I never thought terribly deeply about how much of a privilege it is to be able to, to not have fertility concerns, so many of the women that I work with in my practice are, struggling with that journey. It seems to be becoming more and more common for a number of different reasons. When I spent, probably the good first half of my life being terrified of being pregnant, right? So just kind of an interesting way that, like, I think the variable of time and where I am developmentally, that these things might shift or change over the years.
But that idea of certain things that you're born into, so those things that happened to you
right
when you were a child,
yes,
they were really out of your control.
Yes, yeah, absolutely.
Okay,
Oh, and I just want to add, you see how it says college dropout times 2?
yes.
One of those was a MyEd dropout. So shout out to dropping out from this school. Yeah.
Well, some of my students are actually curious about, and you jumped into a question actually.
Yeah.
That whole idea, when you were a kid. I know this seems like a simple question, but
Yeah.
I think we all do that. We think I want to be this when I grow up.
Right.
And then life happens, and then you end up somewhere completely different.
Yes.
So I would say that you're in a very active, successful place. Was it a long road? They're kind of curious to know.
Yeah, it was a long and very weird road. I was, so I think the dropping out of MyEd is a little bit of a piece of the puzzle here. So essentially, growing up and accounting for many of my privileges when I explain this, is that, I did grow up, I grew up knowing that education and having a higher level of education, going to college was a possibility, although my parents, my dad did go to college on the GI Bill, my mother did not. And it was something that I at minimum knew about, right? Whereas, so many folks, they don't even, there's so many folks in this city alone that don't have anybody within their, ecosystem that they can reach out to and say, oh yeah, I've attempted higher education, right? But for me, being a kid that had, some of these different intersections going on, especially, being an abuse survivor and just generally being a pretty weird kid, feeling pretty isolated in my family system. There's a lot of alcoholism and substance use in my family, so some instability there. My self-esteem was pretty low, I would say, and that the idea of what I could do and what I would be able to accomplish in the world, or I didn't think that I'd be able to make a whole lot of an impact. Now, that is not to say that, I think artists make an incredible amount of impact, so that is not what I'm saying. But ultimately, as soon as I found out that, I can draw, third grade or something like that, that was it. I was like, oh, art school's a thing? Okay, I have a path, right? And so I squeaked and begged and borrowed and to get into art school here, and I remember choosing this school instead of SAIC and Savannah because I needed to work and I needed to live somewhere where I could afford to do that and wanted to keep my job. I'd like a very cool job at a record store, by the way. So
very crucial. So here's the next slide.
Oh yeah, it kind of coincides, right?
Right?
It's nice, yeah. It's me in my office, and the super weird Facebook page. Essentially, I went to, did all this, and I really kind of had blinders on for what I could be or do. And then I came to art school and actually realized that art school wasn't really for me. I struggled with depression a lot and a lot of other mental health issues, and I think going through this process and being here helped me realize how, without community, how isolating art school can be. I mean, you throw a huge pile of introverts together into one space and say here's a studio, go in there. But I just kind of felt like I was withering away a little bit. I felt kind of lost. And I also struggled a bit with kind of connecting a little bit, or relatability with some of the other people around me. I think because I felt like I scrapped so hard to like, you know, be able to do this, and then I felt like there were, you know, I'm not saying this is true. I'm not saying it's true, it's my perception, that it, you know, felt a little bit like there were, you know, folks that were like, I'm not really sure what I want to do, and this is kind of where I landed, right?
I'm gonna hang out really expensively. Yeah.
Literally, right, hang out really expensively. And so, over and over, I started, you know, kind of feeling like, I'm not sure if this is right for me. And I started noticing that I was getting more excited and about like social action and activism related, like kind of side projects at school versus like my actual homework or artwork. And then along that line, I got pregnant with my son. So my son is 20. And for a variety of reasons, you know, so I was a freshman here when I got pregnant, and I decided to, for a variety of reasons, decided to keep that pregnancy and have my child. So he's 20 now, and he's in college, which is super weird. And during that time, being out of school and feeling pretty lost about what my next steps might be, I was like, okay, I know that there's a part of me that might want to go into, you know, I was thinking about being like a rape crisis counselor or advocate. That was something that was really I was passionate about, but I had very low belief in myself other than, you know, my artistic ability, right? And I think I hadn't yet realized how much that art could like help connect me with other people, right? So right around that time is when I learned that like art therapy exists, and that's a thing that you can study. I wasn't aware of that before. And I actually learned about it from a student here when I was here who was like, oh yeah, my therapist is an art therapist, she's totally rad, you know? And I was like, that's like a thing, right?
I want to be, I'm rad.
I know, I mean, it's a pretty rad job. So that led me to kind of veer off that path a little bit into doing my bachelor's in art therapy, and I went on to do a master's in community psychology, which to me was kind of the best fit for, it allows you to be a therapist and practice, you know, professionally as a psychotherapist, but it also has sort of like a research and program development component, and it's like one of the only programs I could find, at least when I was in school, that really took into account that like those intersectional factors that impact us at like every level of our ecosystem, our microsystem, macrosystem, all the isms that impact how we develop, right? So I absolutely loved it. So after working for a few years as a therapist in a variety of different contexts, I'd say like I started out working with kids and adolescents. A lot of those kids and adolescents were, you know, pretty high risk, kids in and out of institutions, a lot of suicidality and self-injury, things like that. That was kind of like the first, you know, step into my career. And after doing that and jumping into private practice for a few years, I opened my own practice called CLARA Healing Institute. We're in Wauwatosa, that's the front of our building. And this is just an example of some of the types of offerings that we have. So we are a mental health private practice. There's 7 therapists, so it's kind of a collective of psychotherapists, art therapists. We've got like integrative therapists, so folks that are doing like nutrition, body work, things like Reiki. So we try to have a more holistic, integrative approach. And then some of our community offerings are things like, this is essentially a group that we do called Radical Self-Love, where we use this book, The Body's Not an Apology by Sonia Renee Taylor, as sort of like the anchor for looking at body image and how that impacts our mental health from like a very, very intersectional perspective. It's an awesome, awesome book if you're not aware of it. Her social media content's definitely worth following as well. There's a lot of rich discussion there. I was like, what's going on in this picture? I don't remember.
You're excited.
Really excited. Oh, I think I included this because you're like, images, right? And so much of my work is kind of private.
Yeah.
That whole HIPAA thing, I can't like share a whole lot. However, like what I am trying to do with CLARA is create a more community, like sort of a couple different layers or levels of how we engage with the community. So we have like a clinical branch where we provide clinical mental health services, but we also have training and actually specific, like city appropriate training for clinicians. Like you've mentioned, Milwaukee has some very, very unique variables, and I think like at the big picture of like mental health, we don't talk enough about things like, you know, parental incarceration, food insecurity. All of these things really impact the trajectory of mental health and what that might look like, and how folks wind up in all these different systems. And then our third branch of services is kind of like a community outreach, community activism sort of branch. This is artist Tia Richardson. She's a mural artist in Milwaukee. So she did like her book, what's the word? I can't think of the word. Like release. Is that the word? Reveal, you know. She is now, you know, going into children's books and doing artist residencies at schools. So just kind of including that as a way that we try to incorporate community artists into our practice. Yeah, this is just stuff that happens in my office, which is pretty fun. So I just showed these pictures because, like I said, I'm often making a lot of art with my clients. Not always. I don't 100% practice as an art therapist. I am technically not a licensed art therapist, and the art therapist would be very mad if I called myself that. I can say this because my husband's an art therapist and he's all weird about stuff like that. But ultimately, I'm like a therapist that uses a lot of art, is essentially what I would say. It's just an amazing, amazing way to work with people who can, for them to bring to light their inner experience in a way that words can't describe. It's awesome. So I just clicked a quick picture of, that's my table in my office, what kind of my coffee table looks like on a given day. And these are just like pieces, these are kind of art therapy, therapeutic art pieces that, these are mine, that kind of have wound up littered all around my office to kind of show a lot of these are just collaborative pieces that I create with my clients as well.
And one other question that kept coming up that several students asked was just, just after what we all survive as humans, right? Yeah. And then you're back into this this therapy setting. Yeah. And you're helping people with their trauma. Right. And how is that for you to be so aware, and is it just like constant triggering, or what is it like?
What's interesting is that it's not constant, but it definitely can be. A good portion of therapy that is like just being with people almost like through the mundane, right? So a lot of folks, by the time they wind up in my office, they've already been able to find at least some minimum level of safety, whether that's outside of a abusive relationship, or a substance abuse environment or something like that. I work with a lot of like young professionals that are in like incredibly perfectionism driven type of careers and things of that nature. So it really runs the gamut of who comes to seek that. I think just some days are a little harder than others. Essentially, I think that the gains and what you see in people's recovery and healing outweighs the constant potential for triggering. And then there's other days where it's just, I would say that I think like one of the hardest things about managing that type of trauma that's just kind of flowing into your space all of the time, and that, I mean truly, and a lot of therapists who are like trained in like an earlier model, you're kind of taught to be like this really like blank slate and not give a lot of yourself. That is like just not how I roll at all. I would say that all of our clinicians, including myself, are very like relational. Like I genuinely love and care for all of my clients, have, wish the best for them in many ways. But sometimes, even like today is a great example, you just hear so much grief, just so much grief and loss in so many different ways, right? Loss of a relationship, loss of a human being that's important in your life, loss of freedom, loss of financial independence, like loss after loss after loss after loss. And that can be really hard because a lot of times my job is simply to be with them. Like those things can't be fixed, right? You can't bring back somebody who passed away. Some of the impacts of maybe some of the things that people have done to us can't be undone, right? So I think the hardest part is just sitting with people as they walk through it and not wanting to like fix it for them.
Let's see. I guess I'll put two questions kind of together in the sense that people were curious about just the stigma that therapy in general, mental health has in general.
Yeah.
And just times that you've come across pushback because of that. But then also, in so many ways, it is talked about more. So it's not. But it's still sticking around.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think I can speak to that a little bit. So, with the pandemic, so I was, practicing for a couple of years before the pandemic, and then when that hit, it was like, if you were like doing like okay, then you were like not doing okay, and if you weren't doing okay, then you were doing like really not okay, right? And so that was really a huge vehicle for people who maybe had never been in therapy voluntarily before, or even thought that might be an option for them. It's like the first time in my career that like people were kind of showing up and just being like, I don't really even know why I'm miserable, but like, I just am not feeling good, right? And so that was a huge shift, obviously. And I do continue to see the trajectory of that, right? Especially as like, like my generation of therapists are much more like open about like our relational qualities, like being like super compassionate, non-judgmental is like what our practice is anchored on. So I think honestly, that sort of attitude in clinical work is kind of changing that pattern a bit. One thing that I do run into quite a bit, and I could rant about this for a while, is like so I do see kids. Kids, adolescents are I love the teens. Give me a tortured teen, I just love them, but I'll have the parents that, typically parents are initiating this. That is changing a little bit, which is really cool. I mean, I've had 8-year-olds come into my office and be like, I want a therapist because all the kids in my class have them. And like, sounds really cool. I have things I need to talk about, like that genuinely happens, and that just warms my heart, of course. But a lot of times when things are initiated by the parents and not necessarily by the child, there's like this attitude of like, oh, fix my kid. Here's the things that they're doing wrong. And the parents aren't necessarily, they have these sort of blind spots and an ability to see that like their behaviors are just symptoms of, deeper hurt and deeper trauma, right? Or not feeling accepted, feeling rejected, whatever the situation might be, right? And so my husband and I often talk about, there's sometimes a little bit of like this car mechanic vibe of like, okay, I'm gonna like bring the kid, drop them off, and then just let me know when they're fixed, right? That is not the majority of the parents that I see, but it is definitely, and you can, walking into therapy, imagine if you were going to see a therapist and somebody was like, so, you feeling better now? Is this working, right? That's like the energy, right? But, so that, I think, to speak to like the stigma, I think therapy is it's still just very misunderstood. A lot of times people walk in and they don't really know what to expect, which I don't blame them. It's a very vulnerable position. Being a therapist, we're very much in a position of power, and it's very important for us to be aware of that. So I think a lot of times people don't know what that vision is exactly going to look like, right? And then one other thing I just wanted to state about like the stigma that you mentioned is, in the past, I would say 7 years of practice, so I do do a lot of work with kids that are working on gender affirmation, gender transition, a very gender-affirming practice. And by and large, the amount of parents that are coming in with their kids to say, just like help me, I want my kid to be healthy, tell me what to do, tell me what to say, like I want all the information, has like really increased in the past, I would say, good 5 years, which is just really awesome to see.
Goodness. Thank you so much, Kristin.
Yeah. You're welcome.
I'm going to switch over to Debra Lehman.
Debra's
And
nice.
like I said, we won't go out verbatim over these lists. But I think a lot of, it is kind of like a biography in a sense, because there's so many things that you're able to take advantage of. But I really find it interesting that the main discrimination is, being a woman, and still. And I was wondering if you could talk about that a little bit. Just, didn't feminism fix that many years ago, right?
I guess that's what people think, right?
Right.
Although most people don't think that anymore. I mean, I'm not sure about this generation, if you guys feel like issues of that kind of discrimination are a done deal now, that we're all on an equal playing field and life is good. How many people think that? Okay, good to see those heads shaking. Yeah, I mean, in my life, I think that coming to terms and realizing how unequal society is, how discriminatory it is, was it was a learning process through childhood onward. And coming, again and again in contact that women were somehow lesser, probably gave me enough anger to fuel my life path, honestly. It was probably a good thing to have that anger from a very young age, watching the role my mother took in my family. She was very passive. She was a stay-at-home mom. She kowtowed to my father. He was kind of a little unpredictable and could be a bit explosive, and she was always, kind of appealing to him and trying to calm him and feed him. And I just, from little kid on, I was so disgusted by that. I was like, just tell him to shut up. Or I didn't really understand, why did she have to take on that role? And, I've come to understand it better as part of that particular time in history and her upbringing and social roles. So I have a kinder understanding of it. But, I became a very rebellious child, angry, rebellious, and then everything just seemed wrong. We lived in the suburbs. It was an almost all-white suburb, which is total privilege. We had an acre yard, just whatever, good food, safety, but you couldn't walk anywhere. There was no out, there was no downtown, there was no center, there was no diversity. It was I felt like I was in a prison, like a big trap, with nowhere to go. Although there was a lot of woods and swamps and nature, so that wasn't so bad. But from a very young age, I also felt like that wasn't really why were these people trying to keep the world from me? Why was this also fenced in, and why did everybody want to live in a place where everybody was the same? Why would you even want that? How could that not just be a terrifically boring condition, which it was. It was incredible. I didn't like the adults. I didn't like their values. I didn't like how everybody had their own yard. There was no sense of community. It was all each person for themselves. To me, just everything was wrong with it. So that was another awakening that was something, wasn't the way I would want to live when I was an adult.
And I just know from social media that you travel a lot, and that's important. Still
Yeah.
not always.
Yes, to experience different places, different people, yeah. But I think that as far as, discrimination against women, when I was in college and then graduate school was when I really, came like full on with the fact that history is not fair. History, when I was in graduate school, art history, all histories were written by white men. And this was the truth. Like, I can't even, you know, what a shocking thing to realize at some point in your life that everything you're being told, the whole picture of the world and how that is being shaped is written by white men, people completely different from, you know, my point of view. So that was a big realization. And of course, there were no women in any of the art history textbooks when I was in grad school, not one, not a single woman until the late 80s ever appeared in an art history survey book. So, of course, needless to say, there were no artists of color. So this struck me, you know? I mean, apparently it didn't strike everybody, but it really was kind of a devastating realization. I didn't quite even know what to do with sort of the anger that was forming in me. So I did end up working in that field. You know, I challenged my professors. You know, and it isn't just that women were omitted from the texts. It was that the whole entire way that art was being written about and processed was discriminatory. Because at that time, anything about an artist's personal life, what formed them as an artist, you know, things form us as artists. We could be a mother, you could be poverty, you know, all these different life conditions form who you are as an artist, and we were not allowed to talk about that when I was in grad school. You couldn't, you could not like really encompass the personal. It was about the work. There was this formalism. It was very clean. It was objective, and I thought that was all wrong. So, yeah, that was kind of pretty much the path I've been on ever since. And I ended up doing my graduate degree on Mary Noel. Do you all know Mary Noel? The witch of Fox Point, who has the art environment in Fox Point, just up the beach. And I chose to do my thesis on her because she was a woman with a graduate degree from the Art Institute of Chicago in the 1930s, but she lived alone. She had never married. She didn't fit the societal norms of what a woman was supposed to be. And so she was, you know, discounted as an artist, misunderstood, called a witch, and her house was continuously under attack. Mm-hmm. And so I thought, well, that's my subject.
Yes, the art muscle. And so, yeah, so after grad school, I mean, you helped put together this art publication here in Milwaukee.
I don't know, does that have anything to do with privilege or discrimination? I suppose everything does.
Well, let's stick with the anger.
Oh, okay. That's a fun topic. I like that.
And I think now looking at like where this is answering a lot of questions actually.
Oh, okay.
Because you know, yes, when you talk about the privilege of you being a white woman who is not wanting financially, no, right? But has chosen to create an art space, to write about art, to write about specific artists. And so your experience growing up is definitely feeding what you're doing now.
Yeah. So Art Muscle ran from, this is going to sound ancient to you guys, 1986 to 1996. It was around for 10 years. I was in my 20s when I started. I was working at the Milwaukee Art Museum and in grad school. And it was it's like large scale format. It was paper. 20,000 copies were distributed in Wisconsin and then sold nationally on newsstands. So it was kind of a big deal and people really loved it. And it became very popular. And I think why people loved it is because we kind of cracked open the idea of what an art magazine was supposed to be. You know, I am, if you haven't gathered this, very anti-elitist. And the art world tends to be kind of an elitist place. It's, full of gatekeepers, and not everybody is invited equally to the table now or for the past, 500 years. So my ideal world of an art magazine, even though this was coming out of an academic graduate, I was in graduate school, so but my idea was that it would be a populist thing. We would make an art magazine that everybody would want to read, not just art people. Because there's not enough art people in Milwaukee to publish a magazine for them. You don't want to publish something that only your friends read. That would be too much work. So what we did is we made an art magazine that had conventional reviews of art and music and theater and whatever. But we also added reviews of things that I just found particularly interesting, but we wrote about them as if it was art. So, the State Fair. We would review the State Fair. We would review debutante balls. I had never been to one. I was really curious about what that was and if people still had them. So, we would do things like that. We would go to motorcycle swap meets and write reviews of that. And so the content of the magazine was really diverse and kind of playful, and it definitely seeped out of the art world and then back in. So it was popular. People loved the magazine. It was because you never knew what to expect, I would say. After 10 years, I was really tired of doing it, and I decided to try something else. So I had a bunch of kids.
And then years later, well, you're still.
But, I'll say one more thing about running a gallery and doing the publication. I think visibility is such an important thing with anybody who is not privileged, well, even privileged, but visibility is power. Voice is power. And the publication gave voice and visibility to a broader notion of the art world than was getting that visibility. And I still believe that that's really important in the things that we do, that to think about who is visible, who has voice, who gets to be heard. And a big part of this show here is about that. Because all of these people who are incarcerated or formerly incarcerated have no visibility, they have no power, and they have no voice. And, it's like that is a troublesome position because these are people who are human beings who we can learn from. And if we don't hear from them, then we will never know how to fix the carceral system, which is broken.
And so this was, you've said this, I know you've had many people interview you since the show has come into existence before. But as you're working on this 2-year plus project, you also simultaneously have your gallery space down the street going. Yeah, do you want to frame, like, people were interested, like, what all goes into owning a space, and then also that decision of, like, where you want to show.
Okay. Well, let me introduce Paul Salceder. He is the other part of Portrait Society, the gallery manager, and the co-curator of the prison show. Shout out to Paul. I don't want to talk too long about this, but I didn't really mean to start a gallery. I was teaching right here at MyAd for 10 years, part-time in art history, and then a little bit later I taught critical writing. And while I was here, a colleague who also was teaching art history said, "I want to start an art publication. Will you help me?" And I was like, ugh, I don't know if I want to do that again. But I said, okay, I'll help you. I will support you. So we rented a 300 square foot room over in the Marshall Building, and we started an online art publication called Susceptible to Images. Love that title.
That was one of my favorite shirts. I wore it.
Yeah.
Because I
don't
love
even
books.
have one of those shirts. So we were publishing this art review, and here I was teaching here and back publishing an art review, which I really just did not really want to do. And it's so much work. And the terms were very different this time around. You know, it was online, and it worked out okay, but I said, if I'm going to do this, I want to start a little project space, and I'm going to call it the Portrait Society. And we're going to do mini shows that look at the notion of the portrait and also in its contemporary terms. And I called it that, and I wanted to base it on the portrait because I thought, again, this anti-elitist thing, everything in the art world, the one thing that everybody has access to, understands, uses, savors, produces, is the portrait. It crosses all demographics, all economics, all geographies. Everybody has this familiarity with the portrait, and I thought that's such an interesting thing. It's the egalitarian part of the art world. Let's take a deeper dive into it because it's dismissed, right? Portraits are kind of stupid for the most part. So, you know, it's dismissed as not a serious topic. And I thought, oh, this is perfect for me. You know, I get to like tackle this in a serious way and kind of bring out some interest. So I did that for a while, and then lo and behold, the gallery kind of was successful, or in, you know, in the terms that galleries are, which isn't like normal terms of success, but and it kind of grew and it grew and it grew, and finally I stopped teaching at Myatt, and I was a full-time gallerist. What was something, was there a different question about that?
Also, just going on with, you know, visibility. The
Visibility.
artists that you decide to show.
Right, so the gallery is now 15 years old, and it really, you know, it's a contemporary gallery. We show academic artists, artists with MFAs, artists of all ages, but the gallery has always looked to the margins and to individuals who weren't so firmly invited into the conversation or to the table. So throughout its 15 years, the gallery's always mixed self-taught artists with academic artists, old artists, women artists, artists of color, you know, whoever it was who wasn't getting a fair shake. And so this is 15 years ago. The art world has changed dramatically in the last 5 years, probably, and it is a much more egalitarian place. We are seeing many galleries now doing kind of what I was doing for all these years, and but you know, I wonder how deep it really goes. Like, we're kind of at that honeymoon period with this. Like, wow, look at the art world; it's really diverse. Old women are getting shows, and black people, and brown people, and trans people, but it still feels like it's a little. You know, what is it really about? It's like, it's paranoia right now because everybody needs to correct all this horrific history and all this bad behavior. But, you know, hopefully it'll last. Hopefully these are deep, deep changes that will catch up, will unearth, you know, the meaning and the importance and rewrite these histories.
And so I was just, I think this is the last slide that I have for you. Is, before the show is currently at your space, this show is up there, highlighting these two women.
Mm-hmm.
And you would categorize them, I think, both as self-taught.
Yes.
No, yes.
Yes.
And then just some examples. But I love and appreciate the fact that you're still here in Milwaukee.
Oh.
Milwaukee is a very messed up, strange place, but I do feel some weird kinship to it, so I'm glad that you're doing what you're doing.
Thank you.
Let's move on to Taka's world. So your lists were very, very, very short and to the point. And my students like latched on to that right away. And I do, of course, have some examples of your art right after this. But But I think for a lot of people, they were curious about that whole idea of putting, the ability to speak English without an accent in both lists, and kind of a lot of things in both lists,
Yeah.
How would you address that, or how are you thinking about that?
I mean, I think, just right off the bat, reason why I kept both lists short, when you think about societal privileges, societal discriminations, both those have to deal with some sort of relationship to a hegemonic power structure. So, if you're thinking about societal privileges, if you're in that space, you're occupying a place where if you are among other privileged people, I mean, that becomes something almost not necessarily subliminal, but maybe superliminal, because if the liminal space is discrimination, then whatever the privilege is not necessarily underneath that, beneath that, it exists above that, or almost the discriminations become invisible because the privileges mask all the sort of the struggles that the societal discriminations occupy. So in that way, I mean, I'm lucky enough to occupy some of that space, but that also is something that exists in the other space of discrimination. So in a weird way, I think because these sorts of hegemonic power structures are really dictated by the people that occupy this area of privilege, and these ideas of what goes in there or what occupies that space, I don't really have the ability to author or change any of that because I also exist in the other space. So the reason why these lists are so short is because the only thing that I can really control is me and my body. So that's sort of why, and I guess sort of my path, career path, which is also some of the few things that are on there. But I guess to address your question about societal privileges, being able to speak English without an accent, I mean, that's obviously a privilege because when you think about this notion of the anthropological other, or especially in Western society and English-speaking societies, it's the idea of, can you speak the language of power? And can you do it well? And so in that way, and I mean, even as a child, I mean, English was not my first language. I was born in Japan, and Japanese was my first language, and then I went through ESL programs from kindergarten to first, second grade, and I still remember one of the first, on the playground in first grade, one of the comments that was made by a friend was, oh, you can speak English better this year. So it's this idea of noticing these things of oh, you are becoming more like me, or more like this this world that occupies a sense of power, or gets to dictate things. So in a way, yes, being able to speak the way that I do for the English language is a privilege. But Debra, to your point that you were making about how the art world is becoming much more diverse, or it's becoming more welcome, or including a lot more voices, because the power structure that creates and dictates those decisions is still the English-speaking, with absolutely no accent, fluent English, that, because that is the power structure. For me, being an Asian who can speak English perfectly, if we think again of this notion of the anthropological other, that otherness, I'm not other enough because I speak English like a native born speaker. So in that way, if you put you know, an Asian or an Asian American who speaks or where English is not the native tongue, and when they speak English, they're speaking in a way that has a little bit more of an accent. That to a person who wants to curate a show or put together something that says like, oh, we want to put forth this image of diversity, put forth this image of this and that. If you have option A or option B, which one are you more likely to pick? And I think even when you think about Netflix shows like Aziz Ansari's Master of None, they talk about Indian Americans and playing with an accent. So it's sort of going with that same factor. You know, when you think about correcting this flaw of inclusivity, sometimes even the spoken word can be one of the aspects that can dictate whether you are not other enough.
Move on from the list. And actually this is, I feel like it's kind of tied to what you were just saying. And some of my students were curious, you know, how did you come to make this space? Why was making this project, and maybe if you want to describe it to us a little bit too. Why was this important to you?
Yeah, sure. So cinema is, it's a program that I curate with Janelle Vanderkamp, who's also a Maya FYE instructor here. And it's short films from the experimental art and video world. So very much already not the conventional Hollywood films. These are all made by artists. They're all short. They're all non-linear in their narrative construction, and much more poetic. Sometimes also like essayistic in the way that they're constructed. But it's even within the experimental art world, I think, you know, right around the time that I was finishing grad school, a lot of these major festivals that show these films, like Ann Arbor would be one in the US, and like Rotterdam is one in the Netherlands, which they've gone through a major overhaul, but, and then the New York Film Festival has an experimental program, and all these like top tier programs within the experimental film world, you would see a lot of the same names over and over and over again. And for me, even just watching those works, I got incredibly bored, and I was becoming increasingly frustrated. And I think partly from a selfish standpoint, like I wanted to screen at those places, like, you know, I felt that my work was good enough to show at those places. So I mean, in a way, like, you know, it's a little bit of the ego involved, absolutely, but it also was more about the fact that, you know, there were only X number of films that were being shown, and clearly there are far more artists like myself who felt like my work is probably good enough, why am I not showing here? And it was this need to see, like, yeah, there are a lot of works that are out there that should be shown and that deserve to be shown, and that sort of launched this, and I think this is the 7th year that we've run it, so, and we've done 2 film festivals too, but that just became way too much work. But I'd say over the 7 years, probably shown a couple hundred artists or films. So.
Is it usually in conjunction with, I'm gonna lose my words here, the bookstore? Would it matter?
Yeah.
Is that usually, or is that just a place that you utilize sometimes?
We've actually been there all 7 years. So
okay.
a few times we've had a screening, once at the Union, once at Bar Gallery, and once here. But a lot of times those are usually especially like invited like events. But other than that, the normal program is always in rhythm pattern. And the reason why it's 8 programs a year is it's to align with the academic schedule. So it's always, this idea that this is also an academic resource. And it also gives us time to program and curate. So it's 4 programs during the fall semester, 4 programs in the spring semester.
I wanted to get into some of your work. So this is a shorter video. I hope everything works well and the sound works well. So it's called, go ahead.
I'd say the sound isn't crucial, so if there's no sound.
But I worked with IT. I did. Let's see. Hold that in your brains for a second. I just wanted to show, well, you know what, let me just say it now before I go on. One thing, a question that came up, is there seems to be very personal, seem to be very personal pieces, but at the same time, they also seem pretty political to me, in a way, but in a much quieter way. I think of, where you draw the line and ethics and things like that, and it's a very, it creeps into one's brain, the viewer's brain, whereas a lot of work that I would consider more political, I don't want to say it tries to strangle you, but I mean that's kind of like how a lot of people come at that work, or how they get to the audience, and I feel like you do it in a very different way, which really interests me.
Yeah, I think, for that, I mean, it's really the fact that I think a lot of politics, a lot of political work, it's incredibly didactic. It's about, and it's a lot of political work, I would say, has a lot to do about getting a personal voice across rather than wanting to be an inviting space or actually having multiple voices involved. And I think, for me, in my work, I never want to be didactic. I always would rather ask a question and have people consider a question, because I think that's a lot more powerful, because that offers each individual person to bring their history, their knowledge into the question that's being offered, and then that allows the larger society to sort of shape, inform, cross paths and find similarities within considering those questions, whereas if it's, a didactic piece of work where you're trying to get one point across or your point across, and then you kind of get people who agree or align with that, then it's doing nothing more than sort of perpetuating this notion of the hegemonic power structure, where you're only getting, you're essentially creating monocultures, where you're only getting one voice and only one type of frequency only. So for me, I mean, that's sort of been my artistic philosophy, is that I just want to make works that make people consider a question, or that a work that asks a question. And in the case of how to draw a line, it's an impossible question, because like, where do you draw the line, or where do you line? The line, and it's this notion of the horizon line also, is that, I mean, the horizon line, it's always shifting, it's never in the same spot. Like, if you try to actually identify where the horizon line is, or where the horizon exists, you'll never find it, because it's always moving, or it's something that's relative. So this idea of like perfect morals and ethics. Like, nobody is going to have perfect morals and ethics. It's just humanly impossible. But this idea of, if you're willing to consider where you line in relation to what people consider to be morally good or ethically good, and whether or not that actually is, I think that's what's more important, is to consider, like, what is actually considered good morally or ethically, and do you agree with that, do you not agree with that? If you don't agree with that, then what can be done? So, yeah, I mean, it's really, and it also comes from that idea of thinking is also coming from the Buddhist philosophical point of the self and the no-self, and the no-self is actually like one of the hardest things to comprehend, but it has to do with eliminating your ego and eliminating this concept of existence, which again, if you're conscious, it's really difficult and almost impossible to do. So it was kind of balancing those ideas with, and that came about around, and I put that quickly together after the murder of George Floyd. And probably like 5 or 6 months after that. So, I mean, we were also dealing with the issues of the pandemic, really, like political discourse that was really getting quite violent. So it was trying to balance all these things of where I was seeing not just the country but the world going, and thinking about how sometimes we just struggle to just be. And so that's where that short thing came from.
And going back to the relative inconvenience store, I see that you have one of your hoodies on.
Oh, yeah.
But I showed 3 of these just because, you know, this remains the same, but then you have stop romanticizing inconvenience, stop seeking it, and then stop killing for it.
Yeah.
And that was also a kind of a pandemic time that you were just talking about.
Yeah. In this, I think, I mean, I'd say this maybe is more to do with the current state of investment within capital culture, more than the pandemic. But it also has to do with the fact that when we think about art, and especially this notion of high art, it's this idea that if you want to have this work of art on the wall, especially of notoriety, then it becomes this object that shows status or class, and for a lot of people that becomes something that's unattainable, or just something that they spend so much time longing for. And I just want to sort of turn that on its head, and also I think this was also around the time thinking about how, like, the notion of the convenience stores, 7-Elevens, things like that. Like, I mean, in like the corner, like, convenience stores, like, they were starting to disappear a little bit. But this idea of even the term of the convenience store, and this notion of convenience, especially now, I mean, Amazon is our convenience store, but it's this idea of you just go online, like, you've got something, and it gets shipped to you. We really don't think about the labor or the time that it takes to make things, or all the backstory of what you're actually getting. So this was a way to think about being able to give, you know, art or things that I've made that I just have extra copies of, or things that I just made that I just want people to have. It was a way to allow people to have my work for essentially free. This became a project where essentially I would make stuff, and the people who were interested would just essentially have to say they were interested, pay the cost of shipping, whatever it was. Sometimes it was even free, and I would just ship it to them, and they would have something that I made. And the idea was also, and I still haven't done it, is that things that go up on here are going to be very few and far between. You're not going to have much of a stock. This notion of like out of stock, in stock, that really doesn't exist. And if it's something where, I have an idea for a project or idea for a work, it's kind of like the GoFundMe in a more like less organized ways. I'll throw something out there. If people want it, then they can throw a little bit of money, whatever they want, and essentially they might have to wait an incredibly long time before it's done, which is the relative inconvenience of it, but eventually it will get to them. So, this idea of consumer culture and fighting against that, and urging a form of patience, but also a way to get people things that I've made for essentially free.
One last question from the students. They were curious, what of your many projects or pieces that you've created just really was your favorite to do and you felt like was really received by an audience, whoever that audience was meant to be?
Honestly, I think it's one that I haven't made yet.
Yes.
But it's one that, like a lot of my recent works and current works, it has to do with me trying to get back to Japanese culture. But there's this Buddhist or Japanese tradition called Tanabata, which happens every year on July 7th. And it's this idea of where you would write a wish or a desire on a piece of paper and hang it from a tree, and essentially a lot of people would write their wishes, and this would oftentimes be at a temple, and you would write the wishes, and it was this idea that by writing your wishes and hanging it on a tree, it allows the deities or the gods to read the wishes, consider them, and grant them as needed. So I kind of want to do that on a like societal level, or like in a way like have a way for people to send in certain wishes and desires, and for me, not necessarily to be the deity or the god, but actually allow the gift of having something of that nature to exist in the world. So that's not a project that I've started yet, but that's one that I'm going to do, and I think that's the one that excites me the most, is having this like socially engaged or socially participatory project where people can send in their wishes, and all, even if it's a crude like rendering or a really like small scale version of the wish, even if it's like something that I know I can't do, trying at least the attempt of, or documenting the attempt of it and giving that back to whoever sent it or put in that request.
Yeah, so not being the actual deity, but you're almost like being the digital wind or the digital medium or something. I love that. Just another still from so just something really quickly about the whole idea of photography, film, and video. I feel like students were feeling like it feels very separate from the rest of the art world, even though I think a lot of things are being integrated very well, as Debra and everybody has said. Things are changing, right? But it still feels kind of like this esoteric, separate place. Is there anything you can say to folks who are interested in time-based media, and how to just keep that excitement going?
Like excitement in terms of,
like, if it's not the most, the whole thing is like, do you do a portrait? Is it an oil painting? Like, we still, no matter what year it is, we still think that is the artist, right? But do you feel like the world is expanding enough to keep people encouraged to go that route?
I mean, I think so. I mean, I think I personally am not a huge fan of it. I've actually like stopped using it so much, but I think, I mean, with the advent of like Snapchat, TikTok, Instagram, like Reels and like everything like that, I mean, that's essentially a really like condensed form of nonlinear editing platforms. So, I mean, you're getting people that are essentially creating short 15-second films, which one, that's incredibly toxic and horrible for the attention span, and like I think does a lot more to heighten anxiety than help, mitigate or like resolve it. But I think in a way, like Instagram stories, like I even had an assignment where I had people essentially use Instagram stories and create a 24-hour narrative film where essentially they could only commit, they had to commit to a take, but essentially by using the 15-30 second, or I guess it was 15-second limit of a single take. I mean, I liken that to the notion of using old 16mm cameras that were spring wound where you only had a certain amount of run before the wind ran out. So in a way, you're limited to 15 seconds per take, and then because the story mode is sequential, you essentially have to shoot in sequence, but you're limited to 15-second take. You construct the story in sequence, and then by the end, you have to shoot it in 24 hours, or else your first shot disappears. So in a way, like it was a way to teach like cinematography and teach sequential story structure and narrative structure through platforms that students were much more adept or knowledgeable on. But I think in a way, like how to keep people excited, I think there's a lot of really exciting stuff happening, even in commercial forms, like music videos, I think are really like turning a page in terms of becoming artistic, like experimental short films. But I think just watching stuff, I think, just keep watching stuff, and even if it's, commercial or like Hollywood or television, I think, it's just watching stuff, being critical of it, and then if you are critical of it, making your own work that sort of is a response to it, I think is really the key point.
Thank you so much, Zach. Now we're going to John Land. So I think I mentioned this in the beginning that we just met.
Yes.
But you forwarded me a handwritten list, and I added a slide here. Joining us, I mean, really all I know or knew about you was that you were an artist, and that you were included in the show downstairs. How was making this list for you, for this event?
Well, my first issue was how to try to do it through my phone. And I'm almost completely computer illiterate. A lot of that is by choice, because it just, I really need to be able to feel the thing. And I thought it was an age thing, which it could be, but I think a lot of it is it's just a thing. I need to it's got to be more tactile. And so when you suggested writing it down and taking a picture of it, it was like, well, duh, I can do that. And so I did. And then it was just kind of like, how far do I want to go into this? So I wanted to be direct, yet vague, but also open for discussion. And it is, because that's it.
Well, let's get to some images. So the work that that we see in the show, there's, of course, excuse me for my talking here, there is the targets.
Yes.
That I was just really enamored with for many, many reasons. The whole idea of like time, keeping time. And then there seems to be more of these kind of conceptual pieces that are really text-based.
Yes.
So before we get into pulling those apart, like people were interested in, like when did you start making art? Were you always an artist or was it something recent?
Ever since I was a child, I would make things, but then I would always destroy them because I realized I didn't know it intellectually and I really didn't know it, but I knew that I didn't want people to see it. And so I grew up in a household of profound violence and abuse from mainly the two people who created us. And there was just a lot of dysfunction, and even though I had a profound temper and violence, I was a quiet child, so I would take things in and I'd observe and I'd try to figure things out. And we lived in the suburbs of Chicago, and I was 10 years old, and 68 when a lot of things exploded. So it had a huge impact. So it was just a way of just figuring a lot of this out. And when I was in prison, when I first started doing these, when I started doing the paper, things like that was in prison, but before that, it was throughout my life. And so I would like find driftwood and make it something. My partner at the time, Colette, would love it, and within 3 days I would destroy it. And she thought it was about her. It's like, no, I couldn't articulate it. It was just, there was just something there that I could never really figure out. And it took a while. It took going to prison, having a complete breakdown in prison, not eating until I was almost at a point that they were going to start force feeding me, that I just had a number of realizations, and then things started changing, and then I started accepting things that in the past I would have destroyed, that this is just a part of who I am and what I am. And a lot of it would come from a reactive thing. The father that we had would always tell me that General Motors would never hire a poet. And this is when I was a teenager. And I said, I'll never drive a car. I'd never own a car. I've never owned a car, and I got kicked out of driver's ed, but I can drive a tractor, and I can do things like that. But I just got, at a very early age, for lack of a better term, I was very pissy. I was just really, really angry. Colette would say that my middle finger preceded me. So things would come around, so I started writing poetry. And the poetry, a lot of times, this is not my poem, those are her words, but the poems show up. And then when I had cancer in prison, I started putting them down and creating them.
So did you just start saving stuff, or when did you start saving stuff and not destroying everything?
Well, I think the biggest thing was probably prison, because it was just, it's strange because part of the abuse was, and I'm gonna sugarcoat some of this because it's only fair, but I was locked in a closet. They would lock me in, and she would always say, my mother would say that I always locked you in one closet. It's like, well, why do I remember three? And so, and this is part of my whole contentious, pissy attitude, is just like, come on, own it. And so I learned at an early age, like 5, 6, 7, it was combative. So I can go into that space, I can do it, and then things will come out of it. So what was your question? Let me go back to your question because I'm digressing.
Well, I was just very taken when you said, like, you make something and then you destroy it. But then you're starting to keep things?
Keep it. Well, because I'm in prison, I start, and I forget these things, but in MSDF, which is downtown and it's a prison within a prison, is where I started getting psychotherapy, and there was an art teacher that would come in. But the main thing about it is she would record songs that we loved and would play it during the class. So I went to it because she played one of my favorite Social Distortion songs. So I started drawing and painting. And that's when I painted I Don't Love Freddie Mercury because he's queer. That's just icing on his cake. And I made a little cupcake. And I was excited because they put it up on the wall in MSDF, and within the day it was gone. And it was because of the word queer, and they got all upset. So then, at that point, then it's just like, I'm owning it. I like doing this. And it irritates them. And then when I got moved, right before I was right around the time I got diagnosed with cancer, I did this poem about Emily Dickinson, which is, imagine an argument with Emily D. She has refused your skateboard and you have nailed all her envelopes. So I did a huge scroll. Deb has it now. And then it was just like, it's on. And I would keep them and they would get transported from one prison to the next. And I learned how to fold them up, but towards the end, the scroll was about this big and it was in the locker. And I realized that I had created this kind of power structure against theirs, but the guards wouldn't touch it. They wouldn't mess with it because I had cancer, I was vulnerable. And so it just created this very strange dynamic. And it gave me a sense of empowerment and survival. And then it became kind of like a power thing. Not power and control, but power in terms of a healing object, like crystals, like anything like that. And then it's just like, okay, I guess I'm stuck with you guys. They're just, yes, they're everywhere.
I was curious, so these are some printouts that John had emailed me. So they are what they are, what they are. But I was talking to you before this. This is quite a large, one of those scroll pieces. I don't know if you could.
Yeah, it's 8.5 by 11 sheets. So I think you've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 6, 7. And Neil Cassidy was a writer. He was a friend of Jack Kerouac, who's of the Beat generation. And Neil Cassidy, so he was a Beat. I don't know if people are familiar with like Allen Ginsberg, Jack Kerouac. No, so he was friends. He wrote first, third. Well, then he morphed over to be the bus driver for Ken Kesey and the Merry Pranksters. So he would drive this around. And the number there, 64,928, were his last words before he died. And it was because he had walked along the railroad tracks in Mexico and counted every railroad tie, and then he died shortly after that. And it was just, it's always been a very emotional thing because people always talk about what were the last words, and there's just something really beautiful about that, but then it's just something so profoundly sad. But he was incredibly obsessive. And so I would just, these things would come to me, and it's just like, and they would allow me. You know, it was just, it was a very, very strange thing because it just kind of opened up all the things I dealt with as a child and learning how to cope with trauma, abuse, and not just my own, but witnessing other people's, and then I couldn't do anything about it. At the same time, you know, the burning down the town next to mine because Martin Luther King was just murdered, and I couldn't understand that, and because we had all this wealth at the time, and so there's all these questions like, why is everything so uneven? And then reading Buddhist tracts and all this other stuff, so it was very, very trying time.
Just one more thing about time. Like I said, I was really taken by being to see this downstairs, and you know, like everything has like a date on it. So I was just curious if you could kind of talk about like how it was making these, and was there one a day that you made?
Yes. And I found other ones, but they didn't, and I don't know why, because I have a horrific memory. Especially in prison, you don't want to remember things, but sometimes you do, but you lose it anyway, because it's just, prison is just one day. I mean, you're, what's that animal that can't, is it a groundhog? You can only remember the moment. You only remember, and it was just like, every day was a new day. So I'm diagnosed, they moved me to this prison, and I just started drawing. circles within circles, and then people would say, are these targets? You know, the guards would ask, because I'd put them up on my desk and you could see them from the window. You'd be like, Tyson, the other inmates are worried. Are these targets for them? I'm like, no. I mean, usually they would have poems on them early on. They would have parts of these things. And again, it became this kind of a pushback to me that I was trying to mark my space or whatever. And then it just became a ritual. Every day I would do one. And I never looked at them. So there's 365. I put them all in a little manila envelope and just kept them in there. And it wasn't until talking to Deb and Paul that I just said, here, do whatever it's just not a practical thing for me. And I didn't know, and we don't know for sure if there's only 2 blue ones, but I'd done red ones and I'd done other ones. But there's just something, because I've been diagnosed with dissociative identity disorder, but so I can go into things and just block everything out. And so a lot of that is this. But until recently, I can't be around them. It's just so emotional at this level because I don't remember it here, but I remember it here, and that's where it's really upsetting.
Can I ask a quick question? This is what's on this. Somebody who was in the gallery last week came up and said, do you know, does it start in the middle and work its way out, or does it start on the outside and work its way in?
Both.
Oh.
It would go either way, and it's just, and it wouldn't be like, I'm going to draw it this way. I would just hold the pen and just start, it's like, oh, I guess we're going to do this today. It was just really, I try to remove all thought. I don't want thought when I draw. I just want to go in there and just wander. And it did its job. You know, treatment is a real pain in the ass, but then to do it when it's all locked in like that, because the survival rate of getting out of prison with stage 4 cancer is pretty slim, and a lot of the guys I'd go with all died, and it's just a real fucked up thing. It really is. The whole system is just it's pointless. All you're doing is you're locking somebody up to make change, and there's nothing to do to change. And when you come out and you have to go back to neighborhoods that are impoverished, and you want, so it's the whole cycle. And I think what's important about this is you can get out. You can get out of it. You can break it. I've been sober for a long time, and I'm good with it, and I have a process, but I'm also a bit strange, and so I can remove myself. I don't really worry about the world, and it's heartbreaking. I mean, I would see people all the time that had just gotten out and they're home, go back in again, and Wisconsin's got one of the worst prison systems in the country. It really does.
Through all that, I mean, we were talking briefly before the event started. Through all of that, through everything that you've gone through, you were still very much aware of that you had white privilege in this particular thing, right?
Yeah.
And I was just wondering if you could just talk a little bit on that, about your experience.
It's really clear and there. When I was in the House of Corrections, because when you come out of prison and you get revoked or you get a sanction or something like that from, all the PO has to do is, I heard you were fighting on such and such, and they have to do an investigation. So they move you to the House of Corrections. And the House of Corrections is basically, a unit would be about a little bit bigger than this, maybe twice as big as this, and it's all bunk beds. So you have all, and they're double bunk beds, so you have guys roaming around. And groups racially hang out together kind of, and sometimes you can get along with other people. But if I was with a number of other white inmates, it would be this kind of like pushback, and there'd be a lot of racism and some of that. And it would just be like, what are you saying? And it would just be very, very claustrophobic, very reactive. And I'm trying to think of the point I'm trying to make, but it was just very, very evident of white privilege. And just how it was always like, why are all these guys here? I'm like, well, why don't you ask them what their crimes are? And why don't you ask the other guys, the white guys, or why don't you ask them what their crimes are? And then why don't you start balancing out? And then I would ask the lawyers. And they would be like, well, we have to balance it out so it doesn't look like this or this, so it looks like we're even. And it's not. The criminal system is not even. People are targeted by their race. People are targeted by, if they can be, by their sexual orientation. It's done. It's clear. And if you talk to any lawyer or any public defender, they'll verify it. And Milwaukee is a profoundly racist city. And it's just ridiculous. It really is.
Thank you. Thank you
Sure.
for sharing. I know it's past all of that time. It's midnight, I know. It feels like midnight. I just had like one collective question, and I won't be too forceful with it, but one thing that I wanted to ask that was really important to me is just that whole idea of like education. You know, what we were taught, what our children were taught, what, you know, this generational history, you know, specifically of this country. So of course, you know, I have visuals. So my son, that's him. Looks like manifest destiny in my head. He was just playing in the snow and happy. But he came home with this thick Xerox copy of this Thanksgiving Day thing. And I'm like, oh, well okay, let me take a look at that. I'm like, that looks familiar. And so I quickly went through it, and you know, I was like, I've seen this image before. This is material I was shown when I was a kid, and I bet it was stuff that my mom was shown when she was a kid. And so I was kind of pissed off. I wasn't being mean or yelling or anything. I'm like, oh, well, this is really interesting that your teacher decided to choose this to bring up in class. Because he's in 3rd grade at a Montessori MPS school. And I was just kind of taken aback. And somehow, from the bus stop home, I upset my son. And he's like, I'm sorry, she just gave it to me. And I'm like, honey, I'm not mad at you. I was like, this is just, you know, really, maybe I threw around colonial and all this other stuff. Like, this is really ridiculous. This is interesting. So I upset him, but then we talked about it. And so this was published in 2009. And then with one Google search, I found a resource that was much more interesting, I thought, that was published in 2001, which, you know, had much more interesting things in it, as far as I was concerned. You know, talking about various tribes, you know, fact and cultural facts, plus what the English were coming in as and different stereotypes. I mean, I was like, oh, that was hard. So I was just still you know, like, why was he given this? So this was done in Oklahoma. So my whole idea or question for the panelists is, yeah, education. I mean, I think that is where the answer kind of lies. This just came up on Facebook as a message for today. And you know, as somebody trying to raise a white male in today's society, I'm very cognizant, I'm worried, you know, like, I'm scared about teenage years coming up, but I think it's so much about education. And so if you guys could maybe even just talk about that, about education or what you worry about in American society as far as education goes. And what I'm getting at is like, what is perpetuated? You know, we don't know what we don't know. But yeah, just like, if we're not taught the whole of a history, here we are. But it seems very intentional that we're not taught the whole history. I'm just curious if anybody has any comments about education, maybe your education, or if you happen to be a parent, your child's education.
I think as a parent and as a child, I was always reading, independent reading. And I would go through the whole library. I mean, that's where I discovered, you know, everybody from James Baldwin, Richard Wright, John Dos Passos, Huxley, everybody just go through the library. And I know it's hard because a lot of times people are just like, it's a book, and especially in this society, but it's what I'm attempting to do with my grandsons. And I actually met with them for a little lunch, and Evan, who is 14, it wasn't books we were talking about, it was music. And I was like, so what are you listening to right now? And he showed me, and it was everything from The Clash to Social Distortion to some bands I hadn't heard of that he discussed. I'm like, do you listen to all this? And he was talking about how much he loves it. And I was like, I gotta thank your mothers, because I know both, he has two mothers and then my son, and music is going well, so now it's just a matter of tying into literature. Because I've given up on schools. Our sons are homeschooled. And I know that schools can work, but I really think it has to be just engaging with them one-on-one.
Does anybody else want to add to that? I know it's been nice.
I'm happy to add to it, and I don't know if it's necessarily like answering your question about like the way that history might be whitewashed, or, you know, those different sorts of, you know, the way that colonialism is perpetuated and as this, like, you know, positive narrative or what have you. But I just think a lot all the time about like missed opportunities in school systems and why we sort of, why it's chosen that we teach certain things, yet we have youth everywhere that they don't know anything about their bodies. They don't know anything about emotions and emotional regulation. They have no skills or tools to do that, and nobody around them to look towards, you know, as mentors for that. They're teachers who at one point were, you know, a little bit of surrogate parents are losing it because they can't survive as teachers anymore, and, you know, financially and stress-wise. So I just think about, I think that's something that bothers me a lot is like the silos of different like disciplines, right? So, you know, you've got like primary education or whatever. I don't know why what we've learned from mental health and all the evidence that we've gathered from research, like why that's not directly applied more like directly, right? There's, for example, there's a type of therapy that I practice called DBT, dialectical behavior therapy. And that type of therapy quite literally has a curriculum that could be translated to any age, you know, across any, and it's like, you know, imagine what our world could be like if we were taught, you know, mindfulness, emotional regulation, distress tolerance in kindergarten versus that stuff that you showed, right? So that's just kind of my soapbox that, you know, I'll probably be on forever, but it's just, you know, the missed opportunities and the devaluing of that type of curriculum.
Yeah, I mean, especially with the internet, like it took me a second to find something that looked more promising. I didn't buy the book.
Right.
But we have access to so much information.
So much.
Whether it be, you know, online or through printed material. materials now, so, you know, what's the excuse
Right.
of perpetuating these narratives?
Yeah.
I mean, other than white supremacy. I mean, and everything connected to it.
Yeah, this is a little bit of a, connected to this, but I was on a committee for the Wauwatosa School District for their redoing after 10 years, their human growth and development curriculum, so what we might call like sex ed or health or, whatever. I mean, the pushback on that is like scary. Like scary, like people are gonna hurt people scary, because they think kids are being indoctrinated with information about their own bodies. And it's just wild, So I put that out there too, because I'm just like, a lot of the folks that oppose that type of information about gender, about sexuality, sexually transmitted, infections, so on and so forth, very afraid about transgender education in schools, really believe that like teachers are, like they're not have any right to share this information with children, that this is like some huge violation of their rights or whatever. It's wild, like wild and pretty frightening. So just being a teacher in that position, and I just like watched like literally like they should have had pitchforks, and they were like, accusing teachers of being pedophiles for teaching kids about the gender, binary system. Like, my God. So anybody who's a teacher here, you're awesome. Because it's rough out there.
Is there anybody in the audience who has, I know we've asked a lot of questions tonight, but just curious, is there any other questions that we're curious about?
I have two questions, well, kind of three. Sorry. Okay, so my first question is, I love what you said, Kristin. Hi, I'm Nikki.
Hi.
My therapist is a DBC therapist.
Oh, lovely.
Thank you for the work that you're doing, because we are therapists.
Lovely.
Yeah, we love it. And it's something that I actually, I'm no longer in conversations with my students. I don't practice therapy at my end, but I do provide resources and just draw my own experiences to make sure that our students feel safe.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering, I'm really curious about this curriculum you were talking about, especially, and I used to teach kindergarten as well. But I was just wondering, if there are any resources you could reference, or
Absolutely.
just by email even.
Yeah.
Some resources that might be helpful to kind of share with our students in those one-on-one conversations or otherwise.
Absolutely.
Spread that information, I think.
Yeah, most definitely. I'd be happy to follow up more via email too, to just give you like the direct links and everything. But truly, like so much of this stuff, like you were saying, like it takes 2 seconds to look. If you kind of know what you're looking for, and you know it's like vetted and evidence-based and not like put out there by some crazies from some right-wing crazies or something like that, like it's easy to find and obtain. And I don't believe that anything that's written for like therapeutic value should be like somehow not open to the public, so Marsha Linehan is the founder of DBT, and if you look up anything that she's written, I mean, you could go on Amazon right now and get this, essentially that curriculum manual, and quite literally, it's almost, DBT is a really interesting type of therapy because it's sometimes you think of therapy as like you're gonna like really go back in time and think about your past and how that connects. DBT is a little bit more about like the here and now, and like how can you like regulate your emotions now. Like, yeah, those things matter, but like now, like it pays a lot of attention to like what's going on in your body, like the somatic sort of experience of things, which once again, something that would be so important to teach young people. But there's so many different workbooks, and they're very like pragmatic, it's quite literally like teaching this like it's a skill, because it is a skill, so that would be like, I think a good place to start, and I'll have to think about some more.
Thank you so much. And actually, I have another question for you, if that's okay, is you talked, and I wrote down what you said specifically, is like, you talked about the hardest part being about having a job is
Right.
working with someone that's going through grief or bereavement. That's really, really, really difficult, and I have to just simply be there with them.
Yeah.
I think in like language, it's so easy to be like, yes, that makes sense, and I like identify with that, and I'm wondering how that kind of like settles within your body beyond that. So like, what are the steps that you take mentally to kind of like be okay with that kind of chaos that
I mean, I don't really know if I've completely figured that out. Like, if I'm totally honest, I mean, like, yeah, like that's a fair statement. Like, it's funny because we, as therapists, like, we think of like having like this very sedentary job with like couches and stuff. Like, I'm in chronic pain like a lot because of, you know, the tension that you experience, and like all emotions are actually sensations. We just, you know, they're sensations that happen within the body. We just give a narrative to them based on what our cognitions tell us. So I don't know if I could say that I've necessarily figured that quite out yet, but I do feel like maybe another type of therapy that you might be interested in. Are you familiar with somatic experiencing? Yeah, so really big concept, really big phrasing, but really simple concept that like when difficult things happen to us, you know, we're all about making up narratives about things, and those things can be completely, you know, they're going to be really different based on our lenses. They're not necessarily based in reality, they're based on our perception. But we can really feel and measure and experience like the things that happen in our body, right? So when we, you know, have to think about all throughout, you know, the day, all the times you're withholding and you're tensing and your posture is impacted and you're bracing yourself for something, right? Like our bodies, there's tons of like micro movements going on in there all the time, right? So somatic experiencing is like this way that like people can kind of like release like trauma that's stored in their bodies, like especially if they never had the chance to get it out, like, right, you're describing your childhood, John, and you know, that you didn't, you know, you were angry, right, but you didn't have much of a voice, and you know, imagine it probably wasn't safe to have a whole lot of a voice, right, and now you can scream or create a million targets, or you know, whatever the situation is. So somatic experiencing and art therapy kind of dovetail together nicely because they're both nonverbal.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
I do one more question for you, if that's okay. Oh, of course. So, Debra, I have a question for you, actually, if that's okay. I know that you've been to the portrait gallery, which is gorgeous, and the gallery downstairs is beautifully curated, so thank you so much for that work. The same with you, John. I saw your piece tonight. It is gorgeous. You talked a lot about this idea of elitism and kind of like smashing it, which I love. And I was just wondering, I think you mentioned that the folks that are able to go into the portrait gallery or have their work kind of presented in that space need to have an MFA. And I was just wondering, like,
Oh, no, I didn't say that.
okay.
It's a mixture.
Okay.
It's not one thing or the other.
Sure.
So no, you don't have to have an MFA to show your work there.
Sweet. Okay.
Okay.
Yeah, I was just wondering still, like, beyond that, what are the other things that you like kind of challenge Milwaukee to do to kind of smash that elitism or move past it?
Elitism, maybe that's quite the right word. Maybe it does have something to do with discrimination and privilege in there. I don't think the art world necessarily thinks of itself as elitist, but you know, the gates have always been just pretty tightly kept. So what was your question? Sorry, it's getting late. What have other places done to kind of break down?
I guess, like, what are the, like, how do you continue to challenge that?
How do we continue to challenge that? I mean, I think we're off to a good start. That more and more places are thinking very actively about it, and I do believe that there is an understanding that structural changes have to be made in leadership at museums and art institutions and faculty in order to make those changes go a little bit deeper. There has to be some giving up of control by the people who have always been in control, and being willing to let go of some of that power, which makes people very, very scared, I think. So it's like right now maybe the art world is thinking about, well, how do we open our doors and move to this more diverse, egalitarian, interesting mixture in the art world, which is by nature more interesting than the way things used to be. How do we do that without having to give up too much of our turf? So we're in a really interesting place. It'll be lots of fun to see how it all shakes out.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
It's now bedtime. Thank you so much for staying and coming out. I really appreciate the questions and the dialogue. So thank you so much for
Thank
being here.
you.
Go for it.